If it's Tuesday, it's his first in-person sit-down interview since the stroke that nearly cost him his life on the campaign trail. Democratic Senate candidate John Fetterman speaks exclusively to NBC News about his candidacy and his recovery. And with just 4 weeks till Election Day, candidates clash on the debate stage in Ohio, and Republicans send their reinforcements to Georgia to rally behind embattled Senate candidate Herschel Walker. And President Zelenskyy addresses President Biden and other world leaders in an emergency G7 meeting after Russia's massive attack on Ukraine brought death and destruction to multiple cities there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander. We are officially in the home stretch, just 4 weeks now until the 2022 midterm elections. And there are plenty of developments in 3 crucial races that could determine control of the Senate. First, Georgia. The Republican reinforcements, as we noted, just arrived today to bolster their embattled Senate nominee, Herschel Walker, as he faces allegations that he paid for an abortion for an ex-girlfriend in 2009, even as he campaigns on his support for banning that procedure. Walker has denied those accusations. The head of the Republican Senate campaign arm, Rick Scott of Florida, and Senator Tom Cotton, both rallying with Walker this afternoon, a clear indication of how crucial a race this is for Republicans who hope to retake control of the Senate. Another key Senate race, of course, is Ohio. The Democrat there, Tim Ryan, and Republican J.D. Vance sparring in their first debate last night, and things got heated between the two. Here's a look.
We're getting close to Halloween, and Tim Ryan is put on a costume where he pretends to be a reasonable moderate. But in fact, he said he stands up to his own party. The last 2 Congresses, Tim, you voted for Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden 100%. You consistently toe the party line on every single issue.
I have been a pain in the rear end to Nancy Pelosi. And if Chuck Schumer's the leader, I will be a pain in the rear end to him, too. I'm for Ohio. I don't kiss anyone's ass like him. Ohio needs an ass kicker, not an ass kisser.
Okay, thank you, candidates. Another
well-rehearsed line, too.
This is a race that's polling closer than expected in a state that Donald Trump won by 8 points in 2022. But if the incumbent parties hold on in Georgia and in Ohio, control of the Senate could all come down to Pennsylvania. Democratic nominee John Fetterman sat down with my NBC News colleague Dasha for his first in-person interview since he nearly lost his life to that stroke just days before his Senate primary. In the closing stretch of this contest, the Fetterman campaign is hoping it's going to be another health topic that will decide the race. That's access to abortion.
On the issue of abortion, I just want to clarify your position there. Do you believe that the government should be able to set guardrails on abortion, or do you believe that this is a decision that should only be made between a woman and her doctor?
I'm saying that Roe v. Wade should have never fallen, and that should be codified into law. You know, that's my answer on it, and to be absolutely clear.
But you say you want to codify Roe v. Wade, which protects a woman's right to abortion before viability, but allows states to enact abortion restrictions after that. So do you want to codify Roe v. Wade, or do you want to leave the decision just between a woman and her doctor?
I don't know how much clearer I can say. Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade. That's the way it should have been. That's the way it was for the last 50 years, and that's the way it should be. And we should, and I would vote. And I would vote to get rid of the filibuster and deliver that if I was a senator or that kind of a vote.
So the backdrop to all that, as you could see, NBC News agreed to a closed caption interview as Fetterman continues to face auditory processing issues as a result of his stroke. He'll be allowed to use that closed captioning in the debate between the two men. We're going to have much more on that interview and Fetterman's recovery in a moment, but we do want to start with our NBC News reporters on the trail in Georgia and in Ohio. First, let's get to NBC's Ali Rafa. She's in Carrollton, Georgia, where Herschel Walker just wrapped up his rally with Tom Cotton and Rick Scott. NBC's Jesse Kirsch is in Cleveland, the site of last night's Ohio debate. We're going to talk to you in a moment, Jesse. But Ali, first, these 2 key senators, Rick Scott and Tom Cotton, showing up, that is clearly a message that they think Republicans need this seat if they want to flip the Senate right now. What was the message they were trying to deliver on Walker's behalf today?
Yeah, Peter, this was not only the first time that we have publicly seen Herschel Walker since these allegations surfaced on Friday. This is the first time that we're seeing in-person support by these GOP heavyweights, NRSC Chairman Senator Rick Scott and Senator Tom Cotton, coming to the defense of Walker amid all of these latest allegations. And they're really trying to send a message to other Republicans that these controversies, these allegations don't matter at the end of the day, that he is the best and, quite frankly, the only option that Republicans have right now if they have a shot at winning back control of this currently 50-50 Senate. These abortion allegations, of course, Scott and Cotton both strongly against abortion rights, standing up for Herschel Walker. And it only came up once on this stage behind me. They brought it up in an aspect of attacking Democratic opponent Senator Raphael Warnock's abortion stances. Take a listen to what both of them had to say.
Raphael Warnock and the Democrats want to make this about Herschel Walker.
His son said he
Herschel Walker wants to make this about Georgia's tomorrow.
Have you had any conversations with Herschel Walker about these allegations, and what has he told you about them?
He's denied the allegations. By the way, have you guys asked Warnock about the allegations against Warnock? Why don't you go ask him if he's denied those allegations?
And both of their speeches were notably less of a reason for Georgia voters to vote for Herschel Walker, more of a reason to not vote for Raphael Warnock. I also asked Senator Scott while he was here whether other Republican lawmakers have committed to coming down here to Georgia to stump for Herschel Walker. Of course, he's NRSC chairman, the leader of this effort to elect Republicans to the Senate. He said that more Republicans would be there, but he wouldn't tell me exactly who those Republicans would be. I asked him if he would be back down here in the next 4 weeks before Election Day. He did tell me yes, but Republican voters I spoke with here at this event told me they don't think any of this is even necessary. They were here today to support Herschel Walker, not see Scott and Cotton. They said they made up their minds months ago to stick with Walker.
All right, Allie, thank you very much for that, and good job with your reporting down there. Jesse, I want to get to you in Ohio right now. Again, a state that Donald Trump won by 8 points. The Democrats on the ground there say they need more national help to make this a real fight. It is still pretty much a toss-up race between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance. What did we hear from each of the candidates, their first chance to face off in a debate that, frankly, at times came down to the issue of authenticity?
Yeah, and Peter, there were certainly flashy moments. By the way, this is a state that former President Donald Trump won handily, not once, but twice. And yet we're seeing close to $30 million be poured in here in advertising money from a group tied to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. So clearly Republicans are at least a little bit concerned that this is a closer race than it should be. The candidates were sparring on multiple issues, everything from the opioid crisis, which has been a big problem here in Ohio, to China, to jobs, and any number of other issues, the economy as well. And often, as you mentioned, this was about authenticity as much as different viewpoints, just trying to convince voters that each other's opponent was less authentic Ohio and was entangled in these issues. For example, both candidates were trying to tie each other to being entangled with China as they criticized China. So that was what a lot of this was about. Both candidates committed to accepting the results of this election, which obviously is something still in the aftermath of 2020 and concerns about election denial tied to that's still out there in the ether. And also, notably, Tim Ryan again made clear that he believes that abortion should return to the Roe v. Wade standard. Whereas J.D. Vance, who on his website says end abortion, that is on his issues page, saying he wants to end abortion, word for word right there. He left a little bit more wiggle room last night and said he is open to some exceptions, in which case he would be okay with abortion, but he did not specify. I asked about this of one of his surrogates in the spin room after and was not given a clear answer. And again, he was on cable news this afternoon, Mr. Vance himself, and again, he danced around this topic. So he's saying that there's a little bit more room for exceptions on abortion as far as he's concerned, but he's still not being clear as to what exactly those would be in broad terms. Peter.
Jesse, appreciate your reporting there, as we noted, as you've been talking about in the course of this day as well. Tim Ryan trying to put some distance between him and the National Democrats, among other things, saying of the current president, Joe Biden, that he does not believe he should run for re-election in 2024. We appreciate your reporting on the ground. As we mentioned earlier, NBC's Dasha Burns sat down with the Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor. That, of course, is the Democratic Senate candidate, John Fetterman, his first in-person interview since since he suffered a stroke in May. As his recovery continues, Fetterman is looking to reassure voters there that he's fully capable of handling the rigors of higher office. However, he has not made his doctors available to answer questions about his health. Here's more from Dasha's new interview.
You've been on this road of recovery. I'm sure it hasn't been easy. This is a serious health condition. This is a serious health issue that you experienced. What has that recovery process been like? How has it changed your day-to-day experience?
It's everything. It changes everything.
Yeah.
Everything about it has changed. Basically, having a conversation with your wife, to having a conversation with your children, just things, especially early after the stroke, the ability to really understand exactly what I'm being heard but it gets much, much better where I take in a lot. But to be precise, I use captioning. So that's really the major challenge. And every now and then I'll miss a word every now and then, or sometimes I'll maybe mush two words together. But as soon as I have captioning, I'm able to understand exactly what's being asked. But even after the stroke, immediately after that, I was able to read everything and I haven't lost any memories or anything like that. It's just really the lingering issue that I have.
Yeah, I mean, I know before this you've admitted you hadn't really thought about your health very much. You hadn't taken great care of yourself. What's it like now for you? Is there some frustration in having to face this, every day?
It's not frustration. It's just a challenge, actually. And I always thought I was pretty emphatic. I think I was very, empathetic. That's an example of the stroke, empathetic. I always thought I was very empathetic before having a stroke. But now after having that stroke, I really understand, much more kind of the challenges that Americans have day in and day out.
NBC's Dasha Burns joins us now from the ground in Pennsylvania after that interview with John Fetterman, and to lend us some expertise on the issues of stroke and stroke recovery. We have invited Dr. Pooja Khatri, Division Chief for Neurology and Rehabilitation at the University of Cincinnati School of Medicine. Doctor, stay with us. I do want to ask you some questions about John Fetterman, of course, acknowledging that you are not specifically treating him. But Dasha, to you first. You're the first reporter to sit down and interview John Fetterman in the same room since his stroke. I want some of your observations about what you can tell us about the way that he was able to engage in that conversation and to answer questions.
Well, Peter, look, let's set the stage here a little bit, right? It's Tuesday. We're on Meet the Press now. In 4 weeks, exactly, voters are going to be at the polls. They will be casting their ballots. Right now, I'm actually in front of the Board of Elections building here in Allegheny County, where some voters have already sent in and dropped off mail-in ballots. And yeah, this was the first time that we were able to be in a room with John Fetterman since his stroke. I actually was in that very same room with him back in May, before the stroke, before the primary. And it was a very different interview, a very different conversation, and just a very different environment. You saw there we were using closed captioning technology. The screen that he was looking at was transcribing my questions so he could read them in real time. Because of that auditory processing issue, he has a hard time understanding what people are saying. Once he can read it, though, he can understand. But I'll say even those small moments, as you know, Peter, behind the scenes, when you're having some of that small talk before an interview, during some of those conversations before the closed captioning was rolling, it wasn't clear that he could understand what we were saying. And you can imagine the challenges that might present for a candidate. But I'll say I have gone to several of his rallies since the stroke, and just observationally, I've seen him improve over the course of several weeks, in terms of the length of time that he spent on stage speaking, the energy that he had, the ability to clearly communicate. And the campaign does say he's recovering, but as we talk to experts, and you're about to have a doctor on to talk about this as well, the caveat that experts will say is, look, people can recover from these symptoms, but they can't really say much without knowing details of the health condition. So we have asked for those medical records. We've asked for interviews with folks on his medical team. Those requests have been denied, both both from NBC News and other outlets, Peter.
Yeah, Dasha, thanks so much. Stay with us. I want to get to more of your conversation. Dr. Khatri, though, since you're with us, you heard a little bit of our interview with John Fetterman. Of course, we're not asking you to diagnose him, but can you give us a sense of what you make of what you heard there? Is that common for stroke patients to be able to read something and comprehend it better than for them to hear it directly?
It's certainly not uncommon. There are basically overlapping circuits in the brain that affect your ability to be able to read versus hear and then comprehend that language. And so certainly not uncommon at all. And that's part of the recovery process. There's recovery where the brain is actually healing, and there's also rehabilitation where you learn to work around some of the injury to live your life fully.
So I think the simple question that a lot of Americans, certainly Pennsylvanians, may be asking is, do the speech issues necessarily mean that cognitive function is impaired? Is he able to make the same types of decisions that he would have after the stroke as he would have beforehand?
You know, it's a really common misconception. In fact, I get that call sometimes even from emergency departments. The patient is confused, and actually they're not confused at all. They're just having trouble producing their words. And we see this also in patients who make a really good dramatic recovery with some of our emergency treatments, where they'll tell us, you know, you were so nice, you were talking to me so slowly, I knew what was going on. And we can do cognitive testing that can show us that actually people are thinking just fine. They just can't get those words out. And sometimes they can write, they can read. Reading is clearly helping him. So how important is adaptive technology for recovery? I mean, if John Fetterman becomes Senator John Fetterman, what would need to be different for him to accommodate the unique challenges that he would face? You know, it's really early. You know, people make their biggest strides in recovery in these first 6 months, and then they continue to recover over years. So, you know, it's hard for me to predict what he's going to need by the time he were to be in the Senate. But I'll say that there are a lot of, you know, straightforward adaptive technologies like the closed captioning that he's using right now. And I can imagine that that could allow him to function well and provide an important perspective on disability and stroke in his work in the Senate.
That's a point he's tried to make on the trail as well. Dr. Khatri, we very much appreciate your spending time with us and sharing your expertise. I want to bring Dasha back if I can. Quickly, Dasha, I want to dig a little bit further into that interview with you. Obviously, one of the issues that's been a real challenge for a lot of Democrats nationwide has been the topic of crime. Republicans have been hitting them on that issue nationwide. Certainly, Fetterman has been pounded by the Oz campaign on that specific issue as well. Did you have a chance to talk about that, and what else sort of struck you?
Yeah, absolutely, and you can see more of that tonight on Nightly News, and the Today Show tomorrow will address the topic of crime. And look, this is something that the experts I've been talking to actually credit some of the tightening, the shrinking lead that Fetterman has had to the issue of crime and how much money Republicans have spent on the airwaves, pounding him as soft on crime. I asked him straight out, are you soft on crime? He said no. You know, one of the aspects of his job as lieutenant governor has been to be head of the pardons board, and he has voted for paroling some folks that have been convicted of serious crimes like murder. That's one thing that his opponent has been attacking him about. He told me, look, we can hold two things at once. I can believe in second chances. I can also be tough on crime. He touted his record as mayor of Braddock, where he brought violent crime rates particularly down significantly. But you better bet this is not a topic that is going away. The GOP is spending a lot of time, a lot of money, not just here in Pennsylvania, but across the country on this issue, Peter.
Dasha Burns, we appreciate your excellent reporting on the ground. Congratulations on that important interview, a chance for Americans to see for themselves what John Fetterman is like these days and how his recovery is coming. As we said, you can see more of that exclusive interview coming up tonight on Nightly News with Lester Holt. Again, tomorrow morning on the Today Show as well. And coming up right here inside today's emergency G7 meeting on the war in Ukraine, what the U.S. and its allies are saying and doing about Russia's deadly onslaught and what Ukraine's president is now asking for. The latest reporting is next, plus a one-on-one interview with the White House's National Security Council coordinator. John Kirby will join us. We hope you'll stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The G7 held a virtual meeting today, one day after Russia launched more than 80 missiles across Ukraine, targeting both critical infrastructure and civilian buildings. Now, according to Ukraine's state emergency service, 19 people were killed in yesterday's attacks, 105 others were injured. In a joint statement, the G7 leaders today condemned the attack, calling it a war crime. President Zelenskyy also participated in that G7 meeting this morning, pleading for more air defense systems, but also pouring cold water on any potential negotiation with Vladimir Putin. As the G7 meets, NATO defense ministers are also gathering in Brussels. The NATO Secretary General telling reporters today that the defense alliance will proceed with its annual nuclear deterrence exercise, adding that canceling them would send the wrong signal to Moscow. I'm joined now by NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel, who is on the ground for us in Ukraine. And Richard, as we heard, part of Zelensky's ask was for more air defense systems. How successful has Ukraine been in shooting down Russian missiles? And are they asking for anything new at this point?
They are asking for more because the Russian means of attack has changed slightly. Russia is using more drones than it has been in the past. The air campaign here has always been fairly insignificant, and that is actually one of the things that has surprised me most about this conflict. It really hasn't been an air war. I'm not very far from the front lines right now, and for the last several months, I've been in areas like this, and you don't hear jets buzzing the sky. You don't hear fighter jets coming in and dropping their bombs. It's been an artillery war. It's been a war of missiles, and it is increasingly a drone war, with Russia using Iranian-made dive bomber drones, the Shahed models, to carry out attacks. And some of those attacks can be very long range. So in order to adapt to the way the Russians are attacking, the Ukrainians say they need more defensive systems. And the U.S., which has been providing some air defense systems from the beginning, has pledged to send more of those anti-missile systems, air defense systems. Germany has also said it will send 4 medium-range systems. So the Ukrainians are putting out this call. President Zelenskyy is personally making this appeal. And so far, at least 2 G7 nations have committed to sending systems.
And Richard, it feels like this recent aerial bombardment was really in some ways an effort to try to sort of break the will of the Ukrainian people. Clearly, their resilience has been demonstrated for months, and it hasn't worked. But it was about the worst bombardment we've seen since the early days back in February. What are you hearing from Ukrainians there on the ground in terms of their response, the will of the people there, even after this recent bombardment?
So it is like the early days, without the fear. And I've heard that from Ukrainians just today. In those early days, this war began, I think it was 5 o'clock in the morning on February 24th. Mm-hmm. And we all sort of watched the Ukrainian response. There was an anticipation that the Ukrainian government, that the Ukrainian military would collapse, in a matter of a few weeks. I was talking to Western intelligence officials, and they were privately saying that they thought the Ukrainian government would be able to hold out for about 2 weeks before it had to go underground and become a guerrilla movement. And Ukrainians themselves, who had been in a state of denial that this was actually going to happen. President Zelenskyy at the time was downplaying the threat of an invasion, even though so many Russian troops were massed on the border, over 100,000 of them. When the invasion began, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were rushing toward the border. There were scenes that looked like World War II, with families, women and children being loaded onto trains, heading to the border, and then people leaving the country. Today, I just crossed into the country earlier this morning. It's almost midnight here now. We didn't see a single person leaving the country. So similar scale of attack that from February, no one leaving the country. There were aid stations set up, tables covered in bottles of water, humanitarian workers with their high-visibility jackets on. They weren't giving out any water. There was nobody to give water to. Instead, at this stage, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of Russians who are fleeing the country, Russian men who don't want to have that knock come on their door and send them off to fight with the new draft.
Yeah, as you note, for the Ukrainian people, this is existential, and none of them are backing down from the fight. Richard Engel, be safe on the ground there now again inside Ukraine. I want to turn to NBC senior international correspondent Keir Simmons. He is in Moscow. And Keir, has there been any reaction by the Kremlin tonight to the G7 meeting that took place today and some of the tough talk that we have now heard from Western leaders, including President Biden?
Well, Russian leaders, President Putin himself, would just dismiss it, obviously. So I think there won't be really much reaction to that. I mean, ultimately, where Richard was talking about the Ukrainians feeling like this is existential, the truth is, and I've been talking to Russians, ordinary Russians on the streets, what they will increasingly say to you, many of them, not all of them, is that they feel like if Russia doesn't keep fighting, that Russia will collapse, that Russia's existence is at stake. And what that really goes to say, Peter, is that neither side is interested in compromise at this point. We have heard today from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov talking about maybe there could be negotiations perhaps at the G20 with President Putin and President Biden. Russian officials telling me that they're not sure actually that President Putin will go to the G20. President Zelenskyy will be there too later this year, by the way. So, you know, America has always been clear that Ukraine would need to be at the table. There would be an opportunity there. I don't think it's very likely. Frankly, both sides are dug in. Russia's air war now with its missiles is just simply a sign that it is determined to try to double down, despite some Western government officials suggesting that Russia is exhausted. Russia is trying to still put up an offensive, its offensive front, if you like.
Keir, I want to ask you, the NATO Secretary General said today that Ukraine needs additional air defense systems after what he's calling Russia's most significant escalation since the start of this war. Has Russia made it clear, would they retaliate if the West sends additional capabilities to Ukraine?
Oh, I mean, listen, the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov today, President Putin, I mean, they've all been clear that they believe, and particularly, by the way, the hardliners around President Putin, who have been calling for a stepping up of the Russian campaign, if you like, for weeks, they've all been clear that they believe that this is a battle with NATO. So they won't be surprised by that news. Certainly, there is a prevalent belief amongst the Russian elite here that it is because of the weapons that have been supplied by NATO that the Ukrainian military is on the front foot. So, you know, listen, that is absolutely what they believe. And it goes back to the point that I was making, which is that many Russians think that this is an existential fight for Russia because they think that NATO wants to see the defeat of Russia. These are very, very difficult times for this country, probably the most challenging times President Putin has ever faced in his 20 years of leadership, because ultimately, and Peter, you know, I've asked since the beginning of this conflict Russian officials, what are you going to do if your strategy doesn't work? They haven't had an answer since February. They still don't have an answer to that. And so ultimately, the challenge for Russia is that question of what comes next.
Yeah, it seems like double, triple, and quadruple down at this point. It's been more of the same, and it just continues to get worse. Keir Simmons on the ground inside Russia for us tonight. Keir, thank you very much. The president's foreign policy challenges do not stop in Ukraine as Saudi Arabia's recent move to slash oil production sparks a backlash from within the president's own party over the White House's handling of U.S.-Saudi relations. The National Security Council's communications coordinator is John Kirby, and he is going to join me next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The White House says President Biden is reevaluating the U.S.'s relationship with Saudi Arabia. It comes less than 24 hours after Senator Bob Menendez, who is the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, urged the president to end all cooperation with the Saudis for underwriting Vladimir Putin's war by cutting oil production. Menendez writes in part, there simply is no room to play both sides of this conflict. Either you support the rest of the free world in trying to stop a war criminal from violently wiping off an entire country on the map, or you support him. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia chose the latter in a terrible decision driven by economic self-interest. Just a moment from now, we're going to be speaking to the national security advisor spokesperson. That is John Kirby. He's going to join us in a second. But first, I want to get to the Washington Post, Leigh Ann Caldwell, Democratic strategist Xochitl Hinojosa, and Republican strategist Matt Gorman. Can you tell I was juggling there as we were waiting to see whether John Kirby made it to the camera in time? We'll pull back the curtain and be honest about that. Give us a sense what you're hearing from the hillside right now as it relates to Russia. There's obviously, we are in this for the long haul. The president said he's not going to back down from it. What are you hearing from those that you speak to on the Hill?
Well, what Senator Menendez said is something that Democrats have been saying for nearly a week now since this decision by Saudi Arabia. Senator Menendez is obviously in a very powerful position as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, so what he says matters. But Democrats on Capitol Hill have been furious about this. We haven't heard as much from Republicans, but this is definitely also going to be an issue that Congress takes up when they come back in November.
Obviously, we heard over the last several weeks, President Biden said privately at a Democratic fundraiser that this is the closest we've been, Matt, to a nuclear Armageddon in 60 years, dating back to the Cuban Missile Crisis right now. Some Republicans have said that he's been too casual in the way that he's talking about this issue. Don't Republicans agree that the president has done one thing effectively, at least, which is unite the Western world against Russia?
Yes, but I think also what they would caution is with the President of the United States and the leader of the free world and the largest nuclear arsenal is going to use the word Armageddon. That sends shockwaves. And so that has to be backed up by a certain level of seriousness. I'm not saying it is, but that words matter, right? We all say that. So I think that is something that took a lot of people by surprise, including Republicans. And look, if this Putin continues to escalate this war, we're going to be hearing a lot more about it, and Ukraine will be back in the news where it hasn't been for a while.
You guys stick with us for a second. I want to get to Steve Kornacki for a second, who's also joining us right now. Steve, thank you for being with us. Give us a sense to what you're hearing right now, and you're keeping a close eye, obviously, as it relates to the midterms that are coming up a short distance from now, just 4 weeks away, where Russia's, is sort of waned in terms of what Americans are keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of ways of looking at it. I think, obviously, look, the stakes, I think we all know, a 50-50 Senate. Republicans just in need of a net gain of 1 seat to get the Senate. Republicans need a net gain of just 5 to take the House here. Typically, you'd look at the president's approval rating and you'd say Republicans are well positioned to do both of those things. Joe Biden's average approval rating sitting at under 43% right now. If you look at the most recent presidents who've been in that territory, this point before their first midterm election, Donald Trump 2018, Barack Obama in 2010, go back to Bill Clinton in 94, all of them lost the House, all of them lost dozens and dozens of House seats. So by that sort of historical standard, this is a perilous place for Biden and his party to be. Where it gets a little bit more complicated right now, though, obviously, is this question of the generic ballot. When you ask folks, Democrats, Republicans, which one would you prefer to run Congress here? Typically what we've seen is when a president has a very low approval rating, in those examples I just showed you there, the opposition party usually enjoys a substantial lead at this point in the generic ballot. But what we're seeing is the Republicans do have the lead, but it's less than 1 point. Right now, on average, it's 0.9 points. That's the Republican advantage on the generic ballot. That is an improvement for Republicans from where they were 2 or 3 weeks ago. If you went back into September, Democrats actually had a slight lead in the generic ballot. So there's been some slight movement towards Republicans here. Certainly, Republicans are hoping this would be a late developing wave. Seen those in the past a few times. 2014 comes to mind, where the Republican advantage didn't really explode until late in that campaign. So that's what Republicans are hoping for. But there is a bit of tension right now between the low job approval rating for Joe Biden and the still very competitive generic ballot that we're seeing here. And it raises the question of, we're always asking that, is something different this time than before? Democrats hope that looming presence of Donald Trump, the former president, maybe creates a new dynamic in this midterm that just hasn't been there in past midterms.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for breaking that down for us. I want to get back to our panel, if I can, on that very topic. And Xochitl, let's get to you quickly for some of your reaction to this. Obviously, one of the challenges had been for the Democrats, whether it was going to be an issue of inflation in the economy or an issue of abortion that really sort of drove this conversation. Has the Dobbs effect, that is to say, has the Roe v. Wade decision now become sufficiently far out that it has waned in its importance for those independent-minded voters that haven't made up their minds yet?
Well, I think it is because of the Roe decision. You do have a closer race. I think a few months ago we were looking at Democrats losing not only the House, but also the Senate. What Steve was talking about, the generic ballot, will likely impact what is happening on the House. I think you'll likely see that Democrats will lose the House. In the Senate, what's happening is each of those senators have high approval ratings, especially the ones where we're defending seats, have high approval ratings in those states, much higher than President Biden. And they are talking about issues like Roe v. Wade and abortion, and also the economy and what they've accomplished.
Let me ask you on that issue of the economy. Obviously, that's been more in the headlines recently. Saudi Arabia thumbing its nose at President Biden. It means the potential for gas prices is to go back up again. Obviously, the way gas prices go, strategists on both sides agree is often the way these elections go. Has that become a problematic issue in the waning weeks?
Well, I think that the economy and gas prices rising does not help Democrats, right? And I do think that while you have people who have started voting and, you know, we're a few weeks away from the election, right, the reality is what does turnout look like at the end of the day? Do we have enough people in our Democratic base that will turn out because of the Roe decision? And how does that impact and counter sort of independents who are, and others who are worried about gas prices? And they should be worried about gas prices. What Democrats have to do is show that they're doing something about it. And that's why I think you have the administration who's a little nervous about it.
Matt, how anxious are Republicans right now?
Well, we're always anxious. It's what, a month out?
That's what the Democrats say.
But no, look, I think the number Republicans look at, especially when I was at the NRCC in 2018, is the president's approval rating. 42, 43%. Unless your name is Manchin or Collins, you can't outrun a president of your own party in a midterm by 7 or 8 points. It's just not done. Typically, folks in Congress and the House and Senate stay between a point or two when it comes to that approval rating.
Leigh Ann, what are the party leaders on both sides thinking about as they sort of imagine control of Congress in the new Congress in the beginning of next year?
Well, I guess everyone's waiting to see what that's going to look like and what that breakdown looks like.
But they're making some plans already, certainly on the Republican side.
They are making plans. And if you're a Republican, no one is jealous of Kevin McCarthy and the job that he is going to have next year if Republicans are in the majority. He has tried to keep his party together when they're in the minority, which is much easier to do. But he's going to have a lot more extreme members, most likely, who are elected, and he has to line that up with.
Is it Kevin McCarthy's job? Is that a no-brainer at this point?
If he is Speaker of the House, yes. There is no one who is actively running against him.
Yeah.
People think it's going to be him. The question is he Speaker or is he Minority Leader? Most people think he's going to be Speaker.
Yeah, at this point, I think it appears to be the way things are going right now. I want to ask you about what we're watching take place in Georgia right now. Herschel Walker bringing in the heavyweights. He's got Tom Cotton, Rick Scott, obviously, who runs the Senate campaign committee for the Republicans right now. And what struck me as I heard the reporters on the ground today, Matt, in Georgia, was they'd ask about Herschel Walker and about these allegations, and they would, like a good politician does, immediately pivot, not even address it, just say, you know what I think about Raphael Warnock and the following. Herschel Walker, the challenge for him right now is he needs to make up ground, right? It's not enough just to get rid of this issue. He has to build some ground and make up some points in that tight race.
Yeah, so the Republicans I've talked to with this, they expect a little bit of a dip in the polling, like they've seen with some of these attacks that have come in the past. But these attacks in the past have resulted also then in a bump to essentially equilibrium, a margin of error race. I think they're waiting to see whether or not this is a little bit more permanent or it's also a bump in the road. And let's remember, Warnock can't get above 50%. He's about 48% after spending a lot of money. So if this ends up in a runoff, a lot of what happens in other states like Georgia or Nevada, if the majority's at stake, that will play a lot into the runoff.
I want to ask you about the John Fetterman conversation. I know we're pivoting. We're going around the horn, as they say, right now. John Fetterman, for the first time, inviting a reporter, NBC's Dasha Burns, to do an interview in person. He used closed captioning. Notably, that will be allowed in the debate that he holds with Dr. Oz only a short time from now. Why? What was the thinking behind this? Is it to sort of make voters more comfortable with this? And do you think it's effective?
Well, it's absolutely right. It's an incredible interview. And I think that what the Fetterman campaign is doing is they're trying to be transparent. He's been trying to be transparent from the beginning. That is what voters want to see.
Well, he's trying to be transparent now because he was starting to see some points get shed.
Well,
no?
and we always knew that all of these races are going to get closer as you get closer to the election, and we know that. But with Fetterman, I think what's interesting is he's trying to tell people, listen, we've all had health issues in our families. We know someone either who's had a stroke or has had some health problems, and this is how I'm managing with with it. I think it was smart to do the interview, especially if he's going to have to be in front of a debate. It's less of a distraction if this comes out a few, days ahead of a debate versus right as the first time they see him do this is at a debate. So from a communications perspective, I think it was well done. And he looked like a strong candidate, and moving forward, I think you want to see him sort of out there talking about the issues and this be less of a distraction.
Two last thoughts, Matt.
Real quick, if Mehmet Oz wins this race, it'll be on crime, though. They've been pummeling him on crime, ads about that. Health will get a lot of the ink. It's a real issue, but crime is the one that will win this race.
And I think you're right. James Carville, as we heard, right, the Democratic longtime strategist, saying if you guys are fighting on the issue of abortion, you're not doing enough here. You got to be able to push back on issues like crime and the economy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I was just I'm doing a story on Northeast Republicans right now in New England, and I'm hearing the exact same thing, that abortion is probably not going to resonate in those states because there's already access to abortion there, and that Democrats need to be focusing on the economy, too.
All right. We'll be looking forward to reading that in the Washington Post. Thanks so much, Leigh Ann Caldwell. Matt Gorman, Xochitl, always nice to have you with us as well. And coming up right here, John Kirby, the coordinator for strategic communications at the National Security Council. He will join us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, the White House says President Biden is reevaluating the U.S.'s relationship with Saudi Arabia after it announced plans to cut oil production. And joining me now is John Kirby, the coordinator for strategic communications at the National Security Council. John, I appreciate your being with us. You said earlier today that President Biden is reevaluating that relationship with the Saudis. What factors go into that decision?
Well, first, I want to apologize for being late, Peter. Poor time management on my part. I wish I had
You got other things to do. We get it.
I didn't do it right today, so I apologize. The president believes, certainly in the wake of the OPEC decision here, that and actually, frankly, from the beginning of the administration, he felt that the relationship with Saudi Arabia, while important, and it still is important, should probably be reevaluated. Certainly in the wake of this OPEC decision, he's more convinced of that now. And so we are going to review the status of this bilateral relationship, and we want to make sure the president's primary concern is to make any bilateral relationship is working to our national interest and advancing our national security. And he just wants to make sure that that's where things are with Saudi Arabia going forward.
So let me try to drill down on that. Is freezing all aspects of the U.S.'s relationship with the Saudis on the table?
I'm not going to get ahead of the president here. He hasn't made any decisions at all, except to say that he wants to take a look at the relationship. But I won't get ahead of what that might look like going forward. He wants to talk to members of Congress, and he's going to obviously give them time to get back to town. But he knows that there's many members of Congress who likewise share some concerns about this relationship. He wants to have time to consult with them as well.
At the risk of you repeating that answer, Senator Richard Blumenthal and Congressman Ro Khanna, among those Congress members, they introduced legislation together today that would halt all arms sales to the Saudis. Is that a more viable option? Is that something, not getting ahead of it, though, something certainly to this point that has been among those that you would consider?
I think the president wants to take a fresh look and again, review this bilateral relationship, make sure that it's working to our national security interests. We also need to remind ourselves that 70,000 plus Americans live and work in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
They too are facing the threat from these Houthi-launched missile and drone attacks into Saudi Arabia. There are American businesses who are based in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is still a strategic partner of the United States and has been for 80 years. So I think whatever we end up doing here, the president wants to take a balanced approach.
As we witnessed when we traveled with the president to Saudi Arabia over this summer. I want to ask about Russia now. The foreign minister there, Sergei Lavrov, said today that Vladimir Putin would be open to meeting with President Biden at the G20 meeting next month. Would President Biden rule that out?
The president has answered this question himself. He said it remains to be seen, and I think that's exactly where he is right now. He hasn't committed to a meeting with Vladimir Putin. I think he's going to think about this in his own time. Right now, the president believes this is not the time for business as usual with Russia, with Mr. Putin. Given what they've done inside Ukraine, he does not believe normal is the right approach.
To be clear, in the past, he said Vladimir Putin shouldn't even be included at the G20.
Again, he's been very clear about where Mr. Putin should sit and stand on the world stage. I won't get ahead of where things are going with the G20. The president said it remains to be seen, and I think that's I think that's where we are.
The president today in a new interview with CNN said of Vladimir Putin that he, quote, totally miscalculated by invading Ukraine. But he also went on to say that he believes he is a rational actor. Does his being a rational actor, in at least the president's assessment, does that mean that he's less likely to use tactical nuclear weapons? Is that the president's words, or is that an intelligence community assessment that he is a, quote, rational actor here?
I think it's both. I think you just look at how Mr. Putin has behaved since before the invasion. Yeah, this was a strategic mistake. He should never have done this. He certainly did not expect the kind of resistance that he was going to get from the Ukrainian armed forces, and he certainly didn't expect the resolve and the unity in the international community to push back on him and to hold him accountable. Now, on the nuclear question, and the president's right. I mean, we believe that he's a rational thinker here. We have not seen, and we're monitoring it as best we can, Peter, we've not seen any indication that Mr. Putin has made a decision to move towards the use of weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons. We haven't seen his military conduct any moves that would lead us to believe that they're even preparing for that kind of an outcome. And the last thing I'll say is, and we're watching this again as closely as we can, we haven't seen anything that's caused us to want to change our own strategic nuclear deterrent posture.
I want to ask you about what we did hear from President Zelenskyy. He asked for additional air defense systems from G7 nations, including the U.S. Notably, the U.S. just announced it's sending 2 what they call NASAMS. These are sort of mid-range air defense systems. Why not send more, given that new bombardment that you just saw?
I would note that we've been sending air defense capabilities since the very beginning of this war, when we were talking about Stingers, which are short-range air defense systems. Back in the spring, when we helped Slovakia arrange to get their S-300, which is a long-range old Soviet system, into Ukraine. And now, of course, we're working on procuring these NASAMS, these surface-to-air missile systems, which are short to mid-range. You're right about that. And we're open to exploring additional air defense capabilities. Secretary Austin, Secretary of Defense, will be meeting with our allies and partners in Europe here this week at another contact group. I'm sure that the issue of air defense will be coming up. There are other nations who have other air defense capabilities that the Ukrainians are more familiar with, that they could also, we could maybe help get into the country. So there's a lot of options here on the table. We're going to continue to look at this going forward because we know it's a real military requirement.
John, one last thought I want to get in with you is Bill Richardson. You know, he said over the weekend that he's, quote, cautiously optimistic that a deal will be reached by the end of this year to secure the release of Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan, of course, being held right now in Russia. The U.S. says they're wrongfully detained there. I know the administration has made clear that private citizens like Richardson, that their involvement could, quote, hinder efforts. But is the administration optimistic, especially in light of this new violence?
What we are is confident that we are serious about getting these 2 individuals home. And we are working very hard to bring that about. We have made a very serious proposal and laid that on the table for the Russians, and we urge them to take that because it will help get these 2 individuals, Ms. Griner and Mr. Whelan, home faster. We're going to keep at it. The U.S. government speaks for the U.S. government. We're going to keep at it. We're going to maintain contact with Russian officials to try to bring that about.
Do we know that they're both well at this point? Have we had any recent contact?
We don't have any indication that they aren't. We are in as close contact as we can be. There are some limits to that, as you might imagine, but every indication we have right now is that they are in good health. But they need to be in good health at home with their families where they belong.
John Kirby, we always appreciate you making time for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Still to come right here, new reporting on the mounting tension within the Secret Service over dozens of seized cell phones tied to the January 6th insurrection. That's coming up. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back to Meet the Press Now. There is some developing news that we have just learned. NBC News now reporting that the Secret Service agents tried to access records of the communications seized during investigations into the events of January 6th, but were denied by their own agency. And NBC News' Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley joins us now. And Julia, just literally as we're sitting here, you've reported out some new details about what the Secret Service has been providing both to the investigators on the Hill and to those within the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. So we are just learning that over 1 million communications were taken from the Secret Service and given happened to January 6 investigators. This does not include more text messages, the thing we've all been asking about since we learned this summer that many of those text messages were deleted when they updated their phones. But it does include emails, radio transmissions, and Microsoft Teams chat. We knew that some of those communications had been handed over. Most people thought maybe in the thousands, but now we understand it's more than 1 million communications.
And to be clear, why this matters, right? A lot of this, at least, or all of it, is coming from personal phones of these Secret Service.
Well, both.
Both. See, their work phones and from their personal phones,
yes.
Which is to say that for the investigators, they may get better information about what the Secret Service knew in real time as we were leading up to the dates and during January 6th.
Right, and those radio transmissions could be really interesting, too, if you think about how they're responding in real time. I mean, just take 3 big lingering questions we have about January 6th. How did the Secret Service respond to protecting the vice president? What happened inside Trump's personal vehicle when we understand from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony he wanted to go back to the Capitol? And were there any communications that may have happened between the Secret Service and the members of those far-right militia groups? Something we weren't thinking about previously, but we learned in court last week that could be a possibility.
The Secret Service publicly said that they would refute Cassidy Hutchinson's claim. They said their agents would, but now we're going to get to see. They haven't testified. Now we're going to get to see that information for ourselves. Perhaps the investigators will, and that could give us much more information about exactly who's telling the truth here.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see that on Thursday.
Yeah, no doubt. Appreciate it very much,
you.
Julia. Thank you. Yasmin Vasugian is picking up NBC News' coverage. NBC News Now. That's right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.